Hello, I'm Chris Flisher, and welcome to Turning of the Wheel, an intelligent, lively discussion about astrology, art, and spiritual adventure. Timing is everything, and as the great wheel turns, we are best prepared when we are best informed. Join me as I explore concepts that allow us to broaden our view of the world. You'll hear interesting topics, meet fascinating guests, and discover who you really are. Using the time-tested practices of astrology, you'll learn how to accept change as the great wheel of life turns. Astrology, art, and spiritual adventure on Turning of the Wheel TV with Chris Flisher. Hey, welcome back to Turning of the Wheel. My name is Chris Flisher. We're going to be discussing today another aspect of astrology in part of my continuing series on the education and the understanding of astrology, or actually learning astrology is a better way of looking at it. And one of the key components we have not discussed yet is the house system in astrology. This is a representation, a graphic representation of the house system. I'm going to go through some details of it in the beginning and show you what it's all about and how it works. But I want to sort of preface all of that by saying that part of the reason you heard me, perhaps for those of you who listened to me in the past, have heard me talk about the time of birth as being an important quality, is because the quality of the time of birth is very critical. Not everybody has this, especially birth certificates that go back many years, don't always have a time involved. So I always try to get the people who come to me for astrological consultation to say, find out from your mother when your birth certificate, what says in your birth certificate, or go to your hospital or go to your town hall or your records to try to get the time of birth. The time of birth sets the orientation of the chart. Okay? For every planet, every sign, the Earth moves 1 degree every 4 minutes. So the Earth is turning, that's every 4 minutes, it's turning 1 degree. So when you map that out, that will equal times 12, you'll have 24 hours in a day. What that means is that for every time of the day, for every 2-hour slice of the day, which equals 30 degrees in the astrology chart, which is what this is right here, for every hour of the day, for every 2-hour period of the day, there's going to be a sign on the horizon. The sun will be in a sign on the horizon. And as the Earth turns, that is going to change every 2 hours, that sign on the horizon. This is different from your sun sign. Your sun sign will always be tied to your birth date. The ascendant is tied to the birth time, so 4:31, 6:15, 3:07 a.m., those are all determined. And wherever the sun is in the astrological chart, the orientation of the sun will determine the rising sign. That is critical because it then sets the orientation for the whole set of houses in the chart. And that can vary dramatically, even when we come to looking at twins. Okay? So what we always look at is the degree of what this particular sign is at that time. For example, if someone was born with 21 degrees Sagittarius and then their twin brother was born 6 minutes later, for example, they would be 23 degrees Sagittarius, and so forth. That's part of the way it works. So the ascendant is here. This sets the orientation of the chart. Directly opposite is the descendant. Up here we have what's called the midheaven, or the medium coeli, and then below we have what's called the imum coeli, or the nadir. Okay, this is the bottom of the chart. These are the 4 cardinal points of the chart. This is the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, the 10th. Those are the houses that we refer to. This is the 1st house, which is the house of self. This is the 4th house, which is the house of family. This is the 7th house, which is the house of relationship. And the top house is the 10th house, which is the house of career. You'll notice that they each reflect each other. So our chart with the ascendant is reflected by our relationship with the partner. So we are, in our relationships, we always find the opposite of us is our partner. That's the mirroring effect of what we are when we see the other person on the other side of the chart. The same is true for our other parts of our lives. We have our home life, which is a significant part of our lives, which is down here, and we have our career, which is at the top of the chart. And these are important placements because these are all going to change. At the time of your birth, there's going to be an array of planets that fall into these different houses when you're born. So, and that's going to vary. I mean, children who are born in similar times, especially for the outer planets, from Uranus, or even actually Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they're going to be generational planets. So everybody born within a certain generation is going to have those planets in certain signs. However, what will be different about it will be that based on the time the person was born, that planet will fall into a different house, meaning it will have different characteristics. This is why I've always stressed the idea of getting to know your ascendant and the time of birth, because that orients the whole chart. This chart will turn Now, the shape of the houses will stay the same, but when the planets are placed inside here, and I'll show this in a further down the road when we do more elaborate discussion, you will see that the planets fall in different houses. When they fall in different houses, they take on the character of the house. And the way we think of the houses, think of it as a stage setting. If you were to go to a play in a theater, and the stage was set up as a tavern or a bar or whatever, you'd see a long bar, you'd see people sitting around drinking, you'd see people talking, maybe you'd see a piano player. You'd know that you were in a bar. If you went to a construction site, you'd know you were at a construction site because you'd see cranes and backloaders and stuff like that. If you went to a classroom, you'd see a teacher in front of a classroom. So these are all such situations where we have a stage setting. The stage setting allows us to determine where we are in our life. And this is determined by the 12 different houses. The 12 different houses each represent something different. We have 4 houses that are angular, the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, the 10th. We have 4 houses that are succedent, that's the 2, the 5, the 8, and the 11. And we have 4 houses that are cadence, the 3, the 6, the 9, the 12. They map to the cardinal, the fixed, and the mutable. And it's more important to think of them in terms of cardinal, fixed, and mutable. I think it's easier to remember them because they have their own distinct qualities. And I've discussed this many times in my other episodes. If you go to my website, turningofthewheel.tv, you'll be able to find the other episodes and get more detailed information there about what I've spoken about. Some of what I'm saying is a little bit repetitive of what I talked about when I referred to the ascendant, but this gives you more of a dramatic, at least it gives you a graphic representation of what I'm talking about, and therefore you're able to get a far better handle, because I think the idea of having the visual is very important to us. So I'm going to go through each of these houses real quickly. They have some certain little identifiers on here that help, or just memory cues for you if you can see it. If not, it's okay. You can find this chart on the web any place. Just look up Astrological Cosmology, you'll find it. It's a great way to understand astrology and the way it works. And as we get further on in our discussions, I will get into more detail about how these things work. And I'm going to do a segment on each of the individual houses. This is more of an introductory situation where I'm able to come along and say, gives you an overview of what the houses are all about, because it's important to understand their placement. So with that in mind, let's start out with the first house. And as I said, the first house is determined by the ascendant. Now, you may have an ascendant in Aries, you may have an ascendant in Taurus, you may have an ascendant in Gemini, Cancer, and all the way around. That is a key piece of who you are. If you've been following me and listening to my lectures in the past, you know that I always refer to the sun, the moon, and the ascendant as the 3 cornerstones of that three-legged stool that supports the personality. And the ascendant is critical because it can change dramatically. I know people who maybe they are a Scorpio, but they've got Gemini in the ascendant, and that changes the way that they respond in that Scorpio energy. It changes the way they deliver. Yes, a Scorpio will be secretive and quiet, but with a Gemini ascendant, which is part of their personality, they may be a researcher. They may be somebody who's very curious, who's talkative, who loves to get the details out there. So these are where the key personality traits really make a difference. We look at the first house. That is the house of self. It's also known, it's the very first of the cardinal houses. It's the house of self. It's the first house. It's what's called the angular, because we refer to the angles as the 4 cardinal points. And in there we think of our identity, our image, and our self. This is sort of our souls. This is how we are. This is our core personality. And in the past you've heard me say, if you look at my episode on the ascendant, you'll see, well, the ascendant is sort of the mask we wear. That's exactly what I mean. It's the face we look like. It's how we project ourselves to the world. You may be in Aries, but if you've got Virgo rising, you're going to present yourself to the world more as a Virgo, especially as you age, but you'll do that with an underpinning of Aries energy behind it. That's a very interesting point. And the nuance there is very clear and understandable once you get the language and understand the logic of the mathematics of the astrology. When we look at, so that's very important. And as I mentioned before, what's directly opposite? The marriage and the partnership, because that's a reflective quality. We reflect on our partners, okay? And if you have planets in the first house, those are going to take on new meaning in the course of your life. The second house is all about money, possessions, resources, and it's typically, and also each of the houses is typically ruled, when we look at it this way, just by the basis of the mathematics, by a typical sign. So the Aries is the first house, Taurus is the second house, Gemini is the third, and so forth, all the way around the wheel till we get to the 12th house, which is the Pisces house. But As I said, that's going to change when I start bringing in individual charts. I'm going to bring in the chart for the United States to look at. I'm going to bring in a chart of famous people who you might know, and you'll say, wow, that really does make sense when we look at it that way. Second house is possessions, value, money, worth, investments. Anything having to do with tangible resources. So that could be any number of things. If your tangible resources could be inventory, if you're a merchant for some reason, or perhaps a builder who keeps a large stock of wood in their house. This is all what's considered to be resources, tangible assets are what we think of it as, okay? Very, very important. When we move on to the third house, we see this is the house where we find siblings, communication, knowledge, logic. This is a very fact-oriented, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. Totally makes sense, because that's the house that Gemini also is in charge of, or assigned to Gemini. That's why it's got that connection there. Because Geminis are talkers, they're teachers, they're animated people who do a lot of self-expression and are very quick thinking, very good with research. So this is the house of communication, knowledge, siblings, and logic. And we'll see as I go back later, we'll see the opposite is always the case as well. We move on to the fourth house. The fourth house is the house of family. It's the house of parents. It's the house of security. It's the house of home. This is our core area. This is one of our core pieces of our lives. When we think of the four core pieces of our life, it's our self, it's our family, it's our relationship, and it's our career. So that's why those are the four most important. Those are the four what we call angular houses, meaning that they match the angles of the chart. So the fourth house, again, has to do with parent. It's ruled by Cancer. It's the house of where the mother resides. Cancer is ruled by the moon. So we have that strong maternal bond there. This is very important to us, especially as we're growing up. What could be more important than a person who's had a healthy, secure, warm, loving environment in their fourth house as they're growing up? These people tend to grow up to be very confident, self-secured people. By the same token, people who have a difficult time in that part of their lives will also reflect that as they go on. So this is why it's important, and we are cast in time as these individuals. The next house we move on to is the fifth house, which is the house that's ruled by Leo, which is also ruled by the sun. And this is the house where we see pleasure. Who doesn't love pleasure? This is the house where we see creativity, where we see children, where we see fun. If you've got Jupiter in your fifth house, wow, you are an incredibly fun person to be with, and you're having a good time all the time. This is a very important piece of the chart, because it shows how we create. It's about self-expression. You know, oftentimes we can express ourselves through anger, but oftentimes our best representation of ourselves is when we express it through creativity, laughter, childishness, having fun, having a certain joie de vivre, having a certain joy of living. Those are all important characteristics of that part, okay? The next house we move on to is the sixth house. The sixth house is typically ruled by Virgo, and ironically or not ironically, completely within logic of astrology, it is a house that is ruled by Virgo and represented by Virgo, I should say. And in this case, we know that Virgos are all about health, they're all about service, they're all about daily work. So this is where we see people who, Virgos are people who have a strong sixth house. And I'll explain this as we get further on in this process. The sixth house need not have anything to do with Virgo in your chart. It may be in a different chart, or it may be Aquarius for all we know, but that is how you will express your ability to give. And when a planet's there, you will see that combination of assets coming to fruition. A sun in the sixth house is going to be somebody who might be a dental hygienist or a lawyer. These are people who serve as a method of as their mode of operation. This is how they get through the world. They do this by service to others. The next house we move on to now, we come to the descendant, which is the opposite of the ascendant, and this is sort of our inner side. This is a place of us that is just where we begin to emerge and show ourselves to the world, because everything below the horizon people typically can't see. It's more hidden within the person, whereas what's above the horizon is what we project outwardly. So when we come to the seventh house is all about, it's about marriage, it's about relationships, it's about lovers, it's about friends. It's all about the relationship. And every one of these single houses has an element of relationship and how we relate to our family, how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to our partners. These are all incredibly important. Seventh house coming around is the one that's the exact opposite of the Aries, so that would be the Libra house, or the house that Libra typically is overruled by. Not doesn't rule it, but it is in charge of, it has influence in that regard. So you have a planet there, it's going to take on a different tone and idea. When we move to the next house, which is the eighth house The 8th house is the house of death. Now that sounds very dramatic, and it doesn't mean that if you have a sun in your 8th house you're going to die. None of that is true. What it really means is it's a broad-based term for regeneration. So death and rebirth are and of course this is the house represented by Scorpio, which is all about death and regeneration. We think about the phoenix rising from the ashes. That's what this is all about. And so that's more important to understand that. It has that quality of regeneration and quite depth. So we all know people who are Scorpios. They are sometimes very, they can go places other people don't go. They're not afraid of the dark side of life. They are very intense. They have this great quality of doing that research as well. That's what that's ruled. And this is a great area of the chart. It also has to do with power, transformation, sex, death and sex. What could be more juicy than those two things? But they're not necessarily where we find. When we find planets in those houses, as I'll get to later on down the road, we will see things along the lines of, you'll see a person who might be interested in the occult if they have a Jupiter there, or their Mercury there. They might like to write about unusual topics, esoteric topics. I'm giving you just a flavor of these things now. This is sort of a teaser, but it's important to understand the logic I'm talking here, because this really does this is a very valuable chart for anybody who wants to understand astrology, to know and to memorize and to get to really understand the nuance that's there, okay? It's very important. Next, we move to the 9th house, which is the house typically assigned to Sagittarius as an influence. And of course, we have Sagittarius ideas there. Philosophy, religion, ethics, belief, travel. Those are all great sort of expressive, expansive kinds of qualities. If you have a sun there, I guarantee you're going to be traveling, or a moon there. You're going to love to travel. You're going to love. You might be involved with religion. You might be a monk or a priest or minister or somebody who's dealing with healing arts or sort of the esoteric, religious founded ideas. Very important to understand that, and that's a really good place for that. The next house we move to is the 10th house. The 10th house is the house of career or occupation. Now, if you're a student in college, say for example, if you're a college student, you don't have a job yet, and hopefully you will when you get out. That's the idea of going to and paying all those student loans, I understand that. But what that means is that is your occupation. So that's your occupation. It's also how you are sort of appear to the world, how your social status, your identity outwardly. It's sort of, oh, that guy's an astrologer, that guy's a doctor, that person's a dentist, that woman is a real estate realtor. So we know that they have these qualities, and this is a part of who we are, which is why it's part of the 4 major ones I first mentioned about, which were the idea of having these angular houses are the 4 most important. Those are equivalent to the cardinal points: the east, the west, the north, the south. Those are the same equivalencies, and that's very important to remember. And those are dictated by the solstices and the equinoxes that occur throughout the course of the year, which gives us that quality of being the tropical astrologers that we are. At least that's what I am. So again, this is where you'd find authority in the 10th house, you'd find fame, you'd find career, and you'd find your social milieu of sorts, if that's the right word, where you're under the umbrella of a social construct. Finally, we get to the 11th house. And the 11th house is all about community. It's the house and this is typically ruled by Capricorn, which is the very industrious quality of the cardinal signs. This is a very strong. This is the hardest worker. If you're going to hire somebody and you want someone to do a good job for you, get yourself a Capricorn. Someone with a Jupiter there is going to do well in their own lives and stuff like that, and we'll get into the details of that further on down the road. The next house we're going to move to is the 11th house, which is right up here. And this is a house that represents friendship and community. It's the house that we typically assign to the Aquarians of the world. And we think of Aquarius as the great sort of community organizers. They're the ones that get the movements going. They're the ones that get the social movements going. They're the ones that create great change, because their view is not internal, it's external, which makes sense because this is above the horizon. This is how they represent themselves to the outside world. And it's a very important one because perhaps now more than ever we need this sort of community organizer to come into our midst. Much the way, if we see ourselves in a time of turmoil, as I think we all could probably agree on that, regardless of your political persuasion, we are in a time of enormous change, speaking currently, of course. If we look back in time in history, where we had other times where we had significant changes, and times when the country was being torn, 2 of our most powerful presidents and most memorable presidents were in charge then. And had they not been Aquarians, we may not have had the outcome that we had. It was because of their dedication to solving these major problems and not a concern with themselves, and their own personal plights. It was more about how do we make this whole thing better? Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, two of our most famous and most pivotal, memorable presidents in time, because Lincoln had to reunite the Union at the time when it was being torn apart. And yet he did not have a very good marriage. He lost one of his children when he was a heartbroken man. He turned all of his energy outwardly to the world. And that gave him that ability to throw all of his energy. And if you know anybody who's an Aquarius, you'll see that they are typically in this sort of community-based environment. Typically, this is where you'll find them. They'll be the person who will be, setting up the food banks. They'll be the people who are doing the, the political drives. They're the one that are going around knocking on doors, getting signatures for petitions. That's the kind of person that we have in that kind of situation. So it's critical and very important. You'll also find your business associates in the 11th house. So your role within your realm of your life and your job, you're going to have people who you associate with, unless you're a stay-at-home coder. But even still, you're going to be doing some of that yourself. You have people you've got to relate to. And these are business associates, people typically who are strong friendships. And we all have people we work with who are also our friends. We meet with them outside of work. But this is also about being on a team. What would it be like if you're on a team and a project at work? This is where you'd find those people. That's the house that's represented by that. And then finally, we get to the 12th house, which is sort of represented or influenced by the sign of Pisces. At least that's under the umbrella of Pisces. Pisces is the end of the zodiacal wheel. We've gone the full circle. And that is the house of transformation typically. It's a house of spirituality. It's a house of solitude as well. It can be a very isolating and lonely kind of sign for that regard. And in that regard, it's also the sign of self-reflection and transformation. It's sort of the end of the road in some ways. Now, people say, well, what does it mean if I've got a planet in the 12th house? It means that there's a greater weight to what that's all about. If you've got Scorpio or Pluto in your 12th house, you're a person who probably has had to deal with death at some point in time early in life. Perhaps, it was just part of your karmic duty that was where you came from. So it's important that we get this kind of color of these, and because these are all the stages of life. Now, you may ask yourself, why were these 12 different areas picked out? Because they represent every part of our neighborhood, part of our joint journey through life. And it is part of and we move through this as time goes on. I'll get to that in another segment down the road further. I want you to keep coming back and listening. We see this is the case. So as I mentioned earlier, there's 4 cardinal points. There's cardinal Aries, Cancer, Libra, Capricorn. So Aries is the beginning, which makes sense because that's the beginning of the wheel. Cancer represents the family, where we are when we're in our younger ages, when we're living and we're adolescents and we're growing up and getting secure and getting our foundation in our lives together. We find that to be there. That's ruled by Cancer, it's ruled by Aries. We go to the 7th house, ruled by Libra. That's our relationships, where we're trying to find equanimity, because Libra has that ability to be this sense of balance. It's the sign of the scales. And in the scales, we see we have to have balance between who we are and who we relate to. Anybody who's married or in a relationship knows that there are compromises you have to make. You've got to find a way to work together. You may not always agree on everything, but in that interchange, you grow and you expand and you move, and that is necessary, and you try to find equanimity in that regard. Okay, so that's important. That's the Libra sign, part of the 4 cardinal signs, also known as the angular, because it's the 4 major angles of the compass. Finally, we get to the 10th house. That is what was ruled by Capricorn, and Capricorn is the earth component of the elemental structure of astrology. There we have, we have the sense of this is the career, where I mentioned earth, and we notice that Capricorns are very earthbound people and very dedicated, strong workers. When we get to the next set of houses, which are the succeedant houses, that is the 2nd, the 5th, the 8th, and the 11th. And those are what's considered to be the fixed signs. Now, the fixed signs would be, this would be the equivalent of Taurus, which is fixed earth. This would be the equivalent of the 5th house, would be the equivalent of the 5th house is the Leo. I'm sorry, Leo is the fixed sign that represents that in the fixed fire sign. Then we move to the 8th house, which is Scorpio, which is the fixed water sign, and finally the 11th house, which is the Aquarius, which is the fixed air. So remember, we've always got one element and a quality of the chart. We go to the next set of houses, which are called the cadence houses. Those are the 3rd, the 6th, the 9th, and the 12th. The 3rd is the house represented by Gemini. Gemini is mutable air. The 6th house is Virgo, that's mutable earth. The 9th house is Sagittarius, that's mutable fire. And then the 12th house is Pisces, that's mutable water. These are all play a significant role, and I'm going to get into these in much greater detail as we move down the road. So we have different ways of looking at them. There's cardinal, fixed, mutable. If you think about that, action starts with the cardinal sign because they are the great initiators. Immediately following is the fixed house, which sort of, so the cardinal sign starts something. The fixed sign comes along and cobbles it together and makes sure that it works, and then moves on to the mutable sign where the whole project is cleaned up. These are metaphors for what I'm talking about. But what's important about most of what I'm saying here, and we're going to get into this in much greater detail, and you can see on the chart over here a lot more detail of what's going on here. What we're looking for is the orientation of the chart. As I mentioned earlier, the Earth moves 1 degree every 4 minutes. So if you think about that, 360 degrees, that's going to give you 24 hours. That's exactly how it works. And in that 24 hours, each of the 12 astrological signs will be on the horizon for 2 hours each day. So for 2 hours, if you're born at that time and you're smack in the middle of that time, you're going to have that as one of your major components. Your moon and your sun may be different places, or they may also be on there, in which case you'd have more power. But the fact of the matter is that they're all going to have that ability. And so when we take a birth chart based on the time, this is a generic chart. It's very important. This is a generic chart, more for educational purposes only. As we move on, and I get into individual charts of famous people who you'll recognize, you'll be able to see the personality traits play out because this whole thing will change. And these houses, rather than having words in there, will be populated by planets. You'll see the glyph, meaning the symbol for that planet in a certain house, and you'll know that that planet has distinct characteristics that are directly tied to that. In other words, it's kind of like the game of Clue, if you ever played the game of Clue. You've got somebody who is, you've got a son in the 5th house. They're going to be a very creative person, and that's how they're going to represent themselves. So the importance of this, and the reason I'm taking the time to go through this is it's important for you to understand this if you want to understand astrology, how this whole thing works. And it's very important that you understand that this chart will change over the course of time. So every day, starting at the beginning of the day, this chart is going to be in that time, and that depends upon the time of year. And then it's going to change. Every 2 hours that will change, and that will determine how that works. So as I said, my goal here is to sort of get into, this is one of the more complicated pieces of astrology, and it's going to take a little more time to get through to it. But I think if you bear with me, and I get to explain, and you write me at my website at chrisflisher.com or turningthewheel.com, you can contact me there, and I'll help to set up explaining for you. If you want a private session, I can do that. In the meantime, I'll be back again with another set of houses. Take care.